November 17, 1942. The jungle canopy drips with yesterday's rain, and the air hangs thick with rot and salt and gunpowder. On the northern coast of Guadalcanal, in a stretch of mud and shattered palms, the Marines have begun calling Henderson Ridge. A young Japanese infantryman crouches behind the splintered remains of a coconut log. His name is lost to history, but his diary is not. He presses himself into the earth as the distant rumble of American artillery fades into an eerie silence. The sun breaks through the canopy in thin golden shafts, illuminating the smoke that drifts like ghosts between the trees. He is hungry. He has been hungry for weeks. His rice ration ran out days ago. The biscuits he carried from Rabaul dissolved into paste in the humidity, then into nothing. He licks his cracked lips and tastes only blood and ash. And then, as he edges forward through the undergrowth, he sees it. A small green tin, discarded near a foxhole. American markings. He picks it up. It is heavy, solid. He turns it over in his trembling hands and reads the English words stamped into the metal. Words he does not fully understand but feels in his gut mean something more than food. Something like abundance. Something like a world he has never known. This is not a story about a battle. This is a story about a tin can and what it contained and what it revealed. It is a story about hunger and ideology, about propaganda and the cold, unshakable truth that enters the body through the stomach. It is the story of how tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers, taught to despise the decadence and weakness of the West, came face to face with a reality that shattered every lesson they had learned. It is the story of American field rations and fresh coffee and the quiet, devastating power of material abundance in the crucible of war. When Japan entered the Second World War in December 1941, its soldiers carried with them not only rifles and bayonets, but a carefully constructed worldview. They had been raised on the teachings of Bushido, the way of the warrior, which emphasized honor, sacrifice, and the spiritual superiority of the Japanese soldier. They had been taught that Western soldiers, particularly Americans, were soft, undisciplined, materialistic. The propaganda organs of Imperial Japan painted a picture of American forces as pampered, cowardly, dependent on luxury and comfort. The Americans, they were told, would crumble under the hardships of jungle warfare. They would break when deprived of their ease, their wealth, their abundant meals. The Japanese soldier, by contrast, was forged in discipline and deprivation. He required little. He endured much. His strength came not from his stomach but from his spirit, from the emperor, from the collective will of the Yamato race. He was taught to view hunger not as weakness, but as purification, a test of resolve. To need less was to be more. This was the ideology inscribed in training manuals, in speeches, in the minds of young men sent to fight across the Pacific. This was what they believed. But belief, however fervently held, does not fill an empty stomach. And by late 1942, as the war ground on and Japan's supply lines stretched thin across thousands of miles of contested ocean, the reality facing the average Japanese soldier was one of escalating deprivation. The logistics of the Imperial Japanese Army were never robust. Japan entered the war as a resource-poor island nation, dependent on conquest to fuel its war machine. Its supply infrastructure was built on optimism and overreach, on the assumption of swift victories and secure shipping lanes. But the war did not go as planned. The United States Navy, recovering from the shock of Pearl Harbor, began to challenge Japanese dominance at sea. Convoys were sunk. Supply ships went to the bottom. Ports were bombed. And the soldiers on the front lines, isolated on islands scattered across the Pacific, began to starve. On Guadalcanal, on New Guinea, on a dozen other forgotten patches of jungle and coral, the rations grew scarcer. The daily rice allotment shrank from 800 grams to 600, then to 400, then to nothing. Soldiers foraged for roots, for grubs, for anything that could be chewed and swallowed. They boiled leather boots. They ate grass. They died of malnutrition and beriberi and diseases born of weakness. And still, they were told to fight. Still, they were told that spirit would sustain them, the Americans. Meanwhile, arrived on those same battlefields with something the Japanese had not anticipated. They arrived with an industrial might that bordered on the incomprehensible. The United States in 1942 was the world's largest economy, a nation of factories and farms operating at a scale no other power could match. And it applied that scale to the problem of feeding its soldiers. The American military understood, perhaps better than any force in history, that morale and nutrition were inseparable from combat effectiveness. A hungry soldier is a weak soldier. A demoralized soldier is a liability. And so the United States invested in logistics, in supply chains, in the unglamorous work of ensuring that every man on the front line had enough to eat. They developed field rations designed for durability, nutrition, and variety. They shipped fresh food across oceans. They established supply depots on captured islands. They brought coffee, canned meat, chocolate, cigarettes, canned fruit. They brought so much food that they could afford to waste it, to discard half-eaten cans and unopened boxes. They brought abundance, not as a luxury but as standard procedure. And to the Japanese soldiers who encountered this abundance, it was a revelation that shook the foundations of everything they had been taught. The tin can in the Japanese soldiers' hand on that November morning was a key ration. Specifically, it was likely a can of meat and beans, or perhaps ham and lima beans, or one of the other combinations that made up the standard American field ration of the Pacific Campaign. The key ration had been introduced in 1938, designed to provide a complete meal in a portable, durable form. Each ration contained 3 cans, one with meat and vegetables, one with bread or biscuits, and one with dessert or instant coffee. Together, they provided roughly 3,000 calories, enough to sustain a soldier through a day of hard labor or combat. The cans were sealed, waterproof, resistant to the heat and humidity that turned Japanese rice into mold. They could be eaten cold or heated over a small fire. They required no preparation, no cooking equipment, no infrastructure. They were, in every practical sense, a self-contained logistics miracle. And they were issued to every American soldier in quantities that seemed, to Japanese eyes, almost grotesque. But it was not just the quantity that stunned the Japanese soldiers. It was the quality. It was the variety. It was the sheer, undeniable reality that these tins represented. A Japanese soldier's ration, when it arrived at all, was monotonous: rice, perhaps a bit of pickled radish, occasionally a small tin of fish or a few soybeans. It was functional, minimal, designed to keep a man alive and nothing more. The American ration, by contrast, was designed to keep a man not just alive but satisfied. It included meat, real meat, in quantities a Japanese infantryman might see once a month if he was lucky. It included sugar in the form of hard candy or chocolate bars, a substance many Japanese soldiers had not tasted since leaving home. It included cigarettes, a small luxury that spoke to a care for morale, for the small comforts that make hardship bearable. And it included coffee. Fresh, instant coffee, in small tins with instructions printed in English, waiting to be mixed with hot water and drunk from a metal cup. Coffee, in the Japanese military, was a rarity, a luxury reserved for officers, if it existed at all. To the average Japanese soldier, the idea that every American private carried his own supply of coffee was almost beyond comprehension. The diaries and letters of Japanese soldiers captured on Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and other Pacific battlefields provide a window into this shock. These documents, collected by American intelligence officers and later by historians, reveal a consistent theme: disbelief. One captured diary, found on Guadalcanal in early 1943, describes the experience of a soldier who overran an abandoned American position. He writes of finding canned peaches, a food he describes as tasting like heaven. He writes of cigarettes, dozens of packs left behind as if they meant nothing. He writes of the waste, the sheer incomprehensible waste of it. Half-eaten cans of meat thrown into the brush, still edible, still good. They throw away more food in a day, he writes, than we see in a week. Another diary, from a soldier on New Guinea, describes scavenging an American supply dump. He marvels at the stacks of crates, the abundance of canned goods, the coffee in small tins. We were told the Americans were weak, he writes. But a weak nation does not feed its soldiers like this. The tone is not admiration, not quite, but something more complicated. It is the tone of a man confronting a lie, and not knowing how to reconcile it. The propaganda had told them that American soldiers were soft, that they needed luxury to function, that their dependence on material comfort was a weakness. But standing in the jungle holding a can of ham and beans, the Japanese soldiers began to understand that this abundance was not a weakness. It was a strength. It was the strength of a nation that could project not just firepower but food, not just soldiers but supply chains, across thousands of miles of ocean. It was the strength of an economy that could produce so much, so efficiently, that waste was irrelevant. It was the strength of a nation that could project not just firepower but food, not just soldiers but supply chains, across thousands of miles of ocean. It was the strength of an economy that could produce so much, so efficiently, that waste was irrelevant. It was the strength of a society that valued its soldiers enough to ensure they ate well, that believed morale mattered, that understood war was not just a test of spirit, but of resources. And this realization, quiet and creeping, began to erode the ideology they had carried into battle. Coffee became a symbol of this realization. To understand why, one must understand the place of coffee in American culture and its absence in Japanese military life. In America, coffee was ubiquitous, a daily ritual, a marker of civilian comfort translated into military routine. American soldiers expected coffee. They demanded it. They complained when it was absent or bad. The military, recognizing this, made coffee a priority. Instant coffee, developed and refined in the 1930s, was included in every ration pack. Coffee was brewed in field kitchens, served hot in the mornings before combat, distributed in small tins for individual preparation. It was, in the words of one military logistician, as essential as ammunition. To the Japanese soldier, this was madness. Coffee was not essential. Rice was essential. Water was essential. Coffee was a luxury, a frivolity, something that belonged to peacetime and officers' clubs. And yet, here it was, in the hands of every American private. Brewed fresh in the jungle, the smell of it drifting through the trees like an accusation. The smell of coffee, in fact, became a recurring motif in Japanese accounts of encountering American positions. It was distinctive, unmistakable, foreign. In the dense humidity of the Pacific jungle, smells carried. The scent of fresh coffee meant Americans were near. It meant they had time to brew it, which meant they had supplies, which meant they had logistics, which meant they had strength. One Japanese officer, captured on Bougainville in 1944, later recounted in an interrogation that the smell of American coffee brewing in the morning was more demoralizing than artillery fire. It told us, he said, that they had everything, and we had nothing. The coffee was not just a beverage. It was a message. It said, "We are here, we are supplied, we are not going anywhere, and we are drinking coffee while you starve." This contrast became even starker as the war dragged on. By 1943, Japan's logistics situation had deteriorated to the point of collapse in many theaters. The submarine campaign waged by the United States Navy was devastating Japanese merchant shipping. Of the supply ships that left Japan for the front lines, an increasing percentage never arrived. Those that did often carried only a fraction of their intended cargo. The rest lost to spoilage, mismanagement, or simple lack of resources. The Japanese military command, focused on offense and conquest, had never invested adequately in the unglamorous work of supply. There were not enough transport ships, not enough trucks, not enough warehouses. There were not enough calories. By 1944, in places like New Guinea and the Philippines, Japanese soldiers were reduced to eating snails, lizards, the bark of trees. They called these battlefields the starvation fronts. Entire units ceased to function as fighting forces, too weak from hunger to march, let alone fight. Disease ravaged them. And the Americans, still eating their C-Rations and drinking their coffee, advanced. The irony was not lost on some Japanese commanders. Lieutenant General Masaharu Hama, before his execution for war crimes after the war, reportedly remarked in captivity that Japan had been defeated not by American fighting spirit, but by American trucks and canned food. It was an acknowledgement, bitter and late, of a truth that frontline soldiers had already learned. The war in the Pacific was in many ways a war of logistics. And in that war, the United States enjoyed an advantage so overwhelming that it rendered ideology irrelevant. One could believe, with perfect sincerity, in the spiritual superiority of the Japanese warrior. One could adhere to Bushido, could embrace sacrifice, could accept hunger as a test of character. But belief did not sink American submarines. It did not replenish supply depots. It did not put rice in empty bowls or meat in empty stomachs. And when the choice came down to spirit or sustenance, when soldiers were starving and the enemy was eating, the cracks in the ideological edifice began to show. The American field ration, then, was more than food. It was a weapon, though not in the conventional sense. It was a weapon of morale, a tool of psychological warfare, a tangible demonstration of systemic superiority. Every can of ham and beans, every tin of coffee, every discarded chocolate bar found by a starving Japanese soldier was a small, undeniable piece of evidence that the narrative they had been fed was false. The Americans were not weak. They were not soft. They were not dependent on luxury in a way that made them vulnerable. They were, in fact, stronger precisely because they had the luxury. They fought better because they ate better. They endured longer because they were supplied. And this reality, experienced day after day, meal after meal, or lack thereof, began to transform the way some Japanese soldiers saw the war. Captured documents and post-war interviews reveal a psychological shift among Japanese troops who encountered American rations. The initial reaction was often scorn, a reaffirmation of the propaganda. "They are weak because they need so much," one soldier wrote in a diary found on Saipan. "We are strong because we need so little." But as hunger deepened, as weeks turned into months without adequate food, the tone changed. Scorn gave way to envy, then to a kind of despairing recognition. Another diary, from the same campaign, written weeks later, reads, Today we ate leaves and roots. The Americans eat meat from cans. How can we win? The question is rhetorical, but it reflects a dawning awareness. The war was not being decided by who was more disciplined, more honorable, more spiritually pure. It was being decided by who could keep their soldiers fed. This transformation was not universal. Many Japanese soldiers held to their beliefs until the end, died believing in the righteousness of their cause and the superiority of their spirit. Bushido was deeply ingrained, and ideology, especially ideology reinforced by years of indoctrination, does not dissolve easily. But even among the faithful, there were moments of doubt, small fractures in the narrative. And among those who survived, who were captured or who surrendered in the final days of the war, the memory of American rations became a kind of shorthand for a larger truth. In post-war interviews conducted by American and later Japanese historians, former soldiers often mentioned the food. They mentioned the coffee. They mentioned the waste. They mentioned the abundance that seemed, at the time, almost insulting, and only later, in hindsight, revealed itself as the signature of a different kind of strength. The coffee, in particular, lingered in memory. There is something about coffee, beyond its utility as a stimulant, that carries cultural weight. It is a ritual, a moment of normalcy, a link to home and peace. For American soldiers, brewing coffee in the jungle was a way of asserting humanity in the midst of chaos, of carving out a small space of routine and comfort. For Japanese soldiers, encountering that ritual, smelling that coffee, it was a reminder of everything they did not have. It was not just the drink itself, but what it represented. A nation that could afford to care about such things, even in war. A nation that valued the well-being of its soldiers enough to ship coffee across an ocean. A nation that had so much it could waste, and still have more than enough. One account from a Japanese soldier who surrendered on Okinawa in June 1945 describes being given a cup of coffee by an American medic. He had been wounded, was being treated alongside American casualties. The medic handed him a tin cup, steam rising from the black liquid inside. He had not tasted coffee in years. He drank it slowly, and it was hot and bitter and sweet all at once, and he began to cry. Not from the pain of his wounds, he later said, but from the realization of what the coffee meant. It meant the war was over. It meant he had lost. It meant the Americans had won, not because they were better warriors, but because they were better at everything else. And in that moment, holding the tin cup, the warmth of it seeping into his cold hands, the ideology that had sustained him through years of fighting fell away. He was just a man, exhausted and hungry, drinking coffee given to him by his enemy. And the enemy had coffee to give. This is the heart of the story. The field ration, the coffee, the canned meat, these were not just logistics. They were a form of truth-telling. They spoke a language that transcended propaganda, a language of material reality. They said, here is what a nation can do when it has resources, when it has industry, when it values the lives of its people. They said, this is what strength looks like. And for the Japanese soldiers who encountered this reality, it was a revelation that could not be unlearned. Some rejected it, clung to the old beliefs, chose to see American abundance as decadence even as they starved. But others, in quiet moments, turning a tin can over in their hands or smelling coffee on the wind, began to understand that they had been lied to. Not about honor, perhaps, or duty, or sacrifice, but about the nature of the enemy. The Americans were not weak. They were overwhelmingly, terrifyingly strong. And that strength was written in every can of food, every cup of coffee, every supply crate stacked in every jungle clearing. The United States military distributed more than 1 billion C-Rations during World War II, 1 billion small green cans. Each one, a self-contained argument against the ideology of sacrifice and deprivation. By 1945, American forces in the Pacific were consuming an average of 5 pounds of food per soldier per day. A figure that included fresh meat, vegetables, bread, and coffee flown in from rear aid depots or shipped from the United States. The logistics tail required to sustain this level of supply was enormous. A vast network of ships, trucks, planes, warehouses, and personnel dedicated to ensuring that no American soldier went hungry. It was expensive. It was inefficient in some ways. It was, by the standards of the Japanese military, absurdly wasteful. And it worked. It worked because it kept soldiers strong, kept morale high, kept the machine of war running smoothly. And it worked as a psychological weapon, a constant reminder to the enemy that they were facing not just an army, but an empire of abundance. The symbolism of the coffee, then, extends beyond the individual soldier's experience. It becomes a symbol of the ideological contest at the heart of the Pacific War. On one side, an empire built on the idea that deprivation was noble, that sacrifice was strength, that the individual existed to serve the state and required little in return. On the other side, a democracy built on the idea that abundance was attainable, that material well-being mattered, that the state existed to serve the individual and should provide accordingly. The Japanese soldier was taught to endure hunger as proof of his virtue. The American soldier was taught to expect coffee because he was valued. And when these two worldviews collided in the jungles of the Pacific, the American worldview, whatever its flaws and contradictions, proved more resilient. Not because it was morally superior in every respect, but because it was materially superior. Because it fed its people. Because it understood that ideology alone does not win wars. In the final months of the war, as Japan's position became hopeless, the food situation for Japanese soldiers deteriorated beyond recognition. On islands bypassed by the American advance, on isolated garrisons cut off from resupply, soldiers died by the thousands from starvation. On Rabaul, on New Britain, on dozens of other forgotten outposts, men wasted away, too weak to fight, waiting for a relief that would never come. And on the home islands, as the American blockade tightened, civilians began to starve as well. The ideology that had celebrated deprivation, that had turned hunger into a virtue, collapsed under the weight of actual famine. The propaganda that had promised spiritual victory rang hollow in empty stomachs. And in the prison camps, in the weeks after surrender, when Japanese soldiers were fed by their captors, the food they received, those same American rations, became a new kind of lesson. A lesson in what it meant to lose, but also in what it meant to survive. A lesson in the strange, awkward generosity of a victor who had enough to share. There's a photograph, taken in a POW camp on Guam in late 1945, of Japanese prisoners lined up to receive their evening meal. The meal is being served by American soldiers from large steel vats. The Japanese prisoners hold tin plates, and the expressions on their faces are complex, unreadable. Shame, perhaps, relief, confusion. The food being served is not elaborate, likely a stew of some kind, bread, coffee. But it is hot, and it is abundant, and it is being given freely. And for many of those men, it is the first full meal they have eaten in months, perhaps years. The photograph does not tell us what they are thinking, but we can imagine. We can imagine the collision of gratitude and humiliation. The dissonance of being fed by the enemy, the slow, painful process of reconciling the reality of American abundance with the ideology that had taught them to despise it. The coffee, brewed in large urns and poured into tin cups, steams in the tropical air. Its smell, once a symbol of enemy presence, of fear and envy, has become something else. A smell of peace, however uncertain. A smell of survival. This is the legacy of the field ration in the Pacific War. It is a small, almost absurd legacy, measured in cans and cups and calories. But it mattered. It mattered to the men who ate it and to the men who went without. It mattered because war is not only fought with bullets and bombs, but with bread and coffee and the capacity to deliver them. It mattered because ideology, no matter how fervently held, cannot substitute for sustenance. And it mattered because it revealed, in the most basic and undeniable way, the difference between a nation that treated its soldiers as resources to be expended and a nation that treated them as citizens to be sustained. The coffee was not the reason Japan lost the war, but it was a symbol of all the reasons, a small, bitter, aromatic reminder that abundance and logistics and the capacity to care for one's people are, in the end, as decisive as courage or sacrifice. In the decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt and transformed, as former soldiers aged and reflected, the memory of those rations persisted. In memoirs and interviews, the coffee comes up again and again, a small detail that carries outsized weight. One veteran, speaking in the 1990s, recalled the first time he tasted American coffee, scavenged from an abandoned foxhole on Guadalcanal. It was bitter, he said, but warm. And I realized then we were not going to win. A nation that gives its soldiers fresh coffee in the jungle is not a nation we could defeat. It is a remarkable admission. A recognition that war is not only about will or tactics or even firepower, but about the 10,000 unglamorous details that keep an army functional. The coffee was one detail among many, but it was the detail that stayed with him. The taste and smell of it, the small, irrefutable proof that he had been wrong about the enemy, and perhaps that is the truest epilogue to this story. Not the battles, not the strategy, not the grand sweep of history, but the small human moments of realization. The moment when a starving man picks up a discarded can and understands, for the first time, what he is truly up against. The moment when the smell of coffee drifting through the jungle becomes not a scent, but a verdict. The moment when ideology meets reality, and reality wins. War is decided by many factors, by leadership and luck and the movement of armies across maps. But it is also decided by this: who eats and who does not. Who has coffee in the morning and who has only hunger. Who can afford to waste and who must scavenge. And in the end, in the jungles and islands of the Pacific, those small daily truths proved as decisive as any battle. The tin can, green and solid and stamped with English words, sits in museums now, a relic of a war long ended. But its meaning endures. It is a reminder that freedom and democracy are not only ideas but systems, not only beliefs but capacities. The capacity to produce, to distribute, to care. The capacity to ensure that the men and women who fight have what they need, not as a luxury but as a right. The coffee, brewed fresh in the jungle, was not just a drink. It was a promise made real. A promise that the nation sending its soldiers into danger would not forget them, would not leave them to starve, would value their lives enough to ship coffee across the world. And to the men who tasted that coffee, whether as recipients or as envious enemies, it was a revelation. A revelation that abundance is a form of strength, that care is a form of power, and that in the end, the nation that feeds its people will outlast the nation that teaches them to hunger.